Eleanor Ashford pulled off her wedding gloves, one finger at a time, set them on a silver tray like they were someone else's property, and walked out into the summer heat without looking back. Behind her, her husband was laughing, not at her, which would have meant he noticed her, but simply passed her as though she were part of the wallpaper he'd long stopped seeing. 3 years. 3 years of silence, of empty chairs at breakfast, of a name spoken only when signatures were required. If you've ever loved someone who looked through you, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel, follow this story all the way to the end, and drop your city in the comments below. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning of the Hargrove Summer Assembly, Eleanor Ashford dressed herself without calling for her maid. It wasn't defiance. It was habit. After 3 years of marriage to Nathaniel Ashford, she had learned that waiting for someone to notice you was a slower kind of dying than simply doing things yourself. She fastened the buttons of her ivory muslin gown in the small mirror beside the window, smoothed her dark hair back with her own hands, and looked at her reflection for a moment longer than she usually allowed herself. She looked tired. She looked like a woman who had been patient far past the point where patience had any meaning left. Nathaniel was already downstairs when she came down. He was standing at the writing desk in the front hall, reviewing a letter, his coat immaculate, his jaw set in that particular way. It always was composed, unreachable somewhere else entirely. He did not look up when she reached the bottom step. He did not look up when she paused at the hall table to collect her gloves. He spoke, but not to her. "Tell Briggs we leave at 10:30, he said, still reading. Eleanor understood after 3 years that she was the one he was speaking to, the only other person in the hall, but he had not found it necessary to use her name. She was simply the nearest available recipient of instructions. "I'll tell them," she said. Nathaniel turned one page over and kept reading. They rode to the Hargrove Assembly in silence. The countryside outside the carriage window was high summer green Virginia at its most reckless and alive, everything blooming without anyone's permission. And Eleanor kept her eyes on these passing fields, because looking at her husband required a kind of steadiness she wasn't always sure she still possessed. Nathaniel sat across from her. He had a folded document on his knee. He read it the entire way. At one point, the carriage hit a deep rut in the road, and Eleanor's shoulder struck the side panel hard enough to make her catch her breath. Nathaniel looked up from his document. Not at her. At the window to determine the road conditions. Then he went back to reading. The Hargrove estate sat on a broad hill south of the town, and by the time the Ashford carriage arrived, the grounds were already filled with the finest families of the county. Carriages lined the lane. Women in summer muslin moved through the afternoon shade. Music drifted from the open windows of the main house, a fiddle, something cheerful and bright, and the sound of it struck Eleanor in a way she couldn't immediately name. It sounded like happiness that didn't require permission. She stepped down from the carriage before the footman reached the door. Old habit again. Nathaniel came down after her, straightened his coat, and scanned the assembled guests with the swift efficiency of a man calculating the social geometry of the room before he'd entered it. He was good at that. He was good at most things that required intelligence without tenderness. "The Hargroves will expect us to speak with them first," he said. "Of course," said Eleanor. They crossed the lawn together. Nathaniel walked with his hands clasped behind his back, and Eleanor walked beside him, and anyone watching from a distance would have seen a handsome couple moving with the quiet confidence of old money and established position. Anyone watching from close enough would have noticed that the handsome couple did not speak to each other, did not incline toward each other, did not share so much as a glance during the entire crossing of the lawn. They were two strangers who happened to arrive in the same carriage. Margaret Hargrove met them at the door with the enormous warmth of a woman who had never met a social situation she couldn't manage. She kissed Eleanor's cheek and held both her hands. "Eleanor, my dear, you look positively lovely. That color suits you wonderfully." "Thank you, Margaret. You're very kind." "Nathaniel." Margaret offered her hand to him with the slightly more formal courtesy she extended to men of his type, wealthy, contained, difficult to read. "We're so glad you could both come." "The honor is ours," Nathaniel said and smiled, and for a brief moment Eleanor could see why women found him compelling. The smile reached his eyes when he chose to use it. It simply hadn't been aimed at her in a very long time. They moved inside. The assembly was in full warmth music conversation, the soft percussion of dancing feet in the next room, the smell of summer flowers and warm beeswax candles. Eleanor stayed close to Nathaniel's side for the first quarter hour. Not because she wanted to, but because appearing separated at an event like this was the kind of thing that started rumors, and she had enough to manage already. She needn't have bothered. Within 20 minutes, Nathaniel had been absorbed into a cluster of men near the fireplace, shipping contracts, land assessments. The usual commerce of powerful men at leisure. And Eleanor was standing alone beside the long window that looked out over the garden, holding a glass of lemonade she hadn't drunk watching the dancing. That was when she saw him notice her. Not Nathaniel. Nathaniel had not looked her direction since they entered the room. The man who noticed her was across the room, standing apart from the main cluster of guests, and he was not watching the dancing or the social maneuvers or the general theater of the assembly. He was watching Eleanor. Not with anything simply with the quiet, direct attention of someone who had observed something the room had collectively agreed to overlook. She looked away, but she had noticed him noticing. And that small fact sat in her chest with an unfamiliar weight. The moment that broke her came an hour later. Eleanor had circulated as she was expected to. She had spoken with Mrs. Pendleton about the charitable linen drive. She had admired the Hargrove daughters. She had declined a second glass of lemonade from a solicitous young footman, with a politeness so smooth it required no thought at all. She had become over 3 years very good at the performance of being present without actually taking up space. She was moving back toward the window. Her window. She had begun thinking of it, the one place in the room she had claimed without anyone noticing when she heard it. The laughter. Not general laughter. Nathaniel's laughter. She knew it because she heard it so rarely that its specific sound had become striking to her the way a single candle is striking in a dark room. She turned toward the sound. Nathaniel was dancing. How was dancing with a woman in a deep blue gown? Mrs. Cecilia Vance. Eleanor recognized her immediately, widowed. The previous autumn returned to society that spring. Beautiful in the specific way that commanded a room's attention without asking for it. Nathaniel was not simply being polite. He was leaning toward her. He was speaking something close to her ear. He was smiling, the real smile, the one that reached his eyes, and Mrs. Vance was smiling back, and they moved through the figures of the dance together with an ease that made something in Eleanor's chest go very quiet and very cold. Around her, 2 women spoke in the careful murmur people use when they want to be overheard. She really is extraordinary with him, isn't she? Well, he always had a particular... A pause carefully waited. Clara Whitcomb was said to be the great beauty of her generation. And Mrs. Vance reminds one of her, I suppose. That dark hair. That way of moving. Poor Eleanor. She must feel it. I don't think he means to be unkind. No, he never means to be anything. That's rather the trouble, isn't it? Eleanor did not turn around. She kept her eyes on the dancing couple, and breathed very slowly, the way she had taught herself in the early months of the marriage, when she was still learning how to receive pain without showing it. Then she set her lemonade glass on the nearest surface, peeled off her right glove, then her left, laid them both on the silver tray by the window, and walked out of the room. The evening air outside was heavy with summer heat. Nothing like the winter assemblies she'd endured in Boston. This was Virginia, in July. Thick and breathing the smell of honeysuckle off the hedgerows, the sound of cicadas rising and falling in the trees. Eleanor walked until the light and the music from the house were behind her, until she was standing on the far end of the garden path, where a wooden bench sat beneath a tulip poplar that had been there long enough to not care about anything. She sat. She did not cry. She had stopped doing that somewhere around the end of the first year, when she'd understood that crying required the belief that things might improve, and she had gradually released that belief, the way you release a rope when your hands have been burned past the point of holding. She sat in the warm dark, and she was very quiet, and she thought with a clarity that surprised her, I cannot keep doing this. Not cannot in the sense of dramatic resolution. Simply cannot in the honest sense, cannot as in the way a person cannot continue holding their breath. Sooner or later, the body simply takes what it needs. She heard the footstep on the path before she saw the figure. "I beg your pardon, ma'am." She looked up. The man from across the room was standing at a respectful distance on the garden path, his hat in his hands, his expression carefully neutral. Not pity, she noted with relief. Not the awful soft pity people had been aiming at her all evening. Something more considered than that. "I was looking for some air myself," he said. "I can find another bench if you'd prefer." "There isn't another bench," Eleanor said. "No," he agreed. "I noticed that too. A silence, but not an uncomfortable one." "Julian Harrow," he said with a slight incline of his head. "I'm here on some business with the Hargrove estate. You're Mrs. Ashford, I believe." "I am." "I won't pretend I didn't see what happened in there," he said. "But I won't mention it either if that's your preference." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. "What is it you saw, Mr. Harrow?" He considered this with more seriousness than she expected. "I saw a woman who has been managing her dignity in public for a very long time," he said. "And I saw her reach the end of what dignity alone can carry." The honesty of it struck her like cold water. "That's quite an observation for a stranger," she said. "I have that habit," he said. "My apologies." "Don't apologize," Eleanor said. "It's the most accurate thing anyone has said to me in 3 years." He sat at the far end of the bench, appropriately distant, and they were both quiet for a moment, and the cicadas went on in the trees, and the music from the house continued, and Eleanor thought, this is what it feels like to be in the company of someone who notices you. It's a very simple thing. It shouldn't feel as rare as it does. Inside the house, Nathaniel Ashford finished his dance with Cecilia Vance, accepted compliments from the men near the fireplace about the profitable quarter his shipping interests had managed, and eventually turned to find his wife. He scanned the room with the efficiency that was his nature. He did not see her. He asked Margaret Hargrove with a measured casualness that revealed nothing whether she had seen Eleanor. Margaret looked at him with an expression he could not entirely read. "She went out for some air, I believe," Margaret said. "About half an hour ago." "Half an hour," Nathaniel repeated. "Are you concerned, Nathaniel?" "Of course not," he said. "I'll find her." But as he moved toward the garden door, he passed the window table, and he saw the white gloves lying on the silver tray. And something about the sight of them, the deliberateness of their placement, the way they lay flat and empty and carefully set aside, stopped him for a moment in a way he was not entirely prepared for. He picked one up. He set it back down. Then he went out into the summer dark to find his wife. He found her on the bench beneath the tulip poplar, with Julian Harrow, sitting at a distance, the two of them speaking quietly, and the sight stopped Nathaniel at the edge of the garden path with a feeling he did not immediately have a name for. It was not rage. He was not a man given easily to rage. It was something more uncomfortable than that. Something that required him to feel things he had become practiced at not feeling. Eleanor looked up and saw him. Something moved across her face. Not guilt, he noted. Not the flustered adjustment of a woman caught in something improper. Something more complicated than that. A kind of quiet measuring, as though she were assessing whether his arrival required anything particular of her. As though she had become accustomed to deciding on her own how much of herself to offer in any given moment. Julian Harrow rose from the bench and inclined his head. "Mr. Ashford, I was just returning to the house." He placed his hat on his head with a small, courteous gesture. "Good evening to you both." He walked past Nathaniel without hurry, and Nathaniel watched him go, and then turned back to Eleanor, who was still sitting on the bench, with her hands in her lap, and the summer dark all around her. "You've been out here half an hour," Nathaniel said. "Have I?" said Eleanor. "People will notice." "Yes," she said. "They will." He waited for more. She offered nothing more. "Are you unwell?" he asked. She looked at him for a long moment. And then she said quietly, and without anger, the words that would stay with him long after the summer assembly was over, and the guests had all gone home, and the Hargrove house was dark and quiet. "I am not unwell, Nathaniel. I am simply finished." "Finished," he repeated. "With waiting," she said. "With adjusting. With making myself smaller, so that my presence doesn't inconvenience you." She rose from the bench with the composed deliberateness of a woman who has decided something, and is no longer asking anyone's permission for the decision. I will sit with you in the carriage on the way home, and I will say good night at the top of the stairs, and I will manage everything tomorrow that is mine to manage. But I want you to know, because I think it matters that you know. Even if it changes nothing, I am finished pretending that this marriage is something it has never been." Nathaniel stared at her. "Eleanor." "I'm going back inside," she said. "We should say good night to the Hargroves before we leave. It's the polite thing to do." She walked past him on the garden path, and he stood very still in the warm summer dark, holding the knowledge of what she had just said, and the thing he had not had a name for earlier. The thing that was not rage, that was more uncomfortable than rage, began to take a shape he recognized. It felt, if he was honest with himself, remarkably like the first stirrings of fear. Not fear of scandal, not fear of the social consequences of a difficult marriage. Fear that he had left something very valuable out in the rain for so long that he might walk out one morning and find it was simply gone. He stood on the garden path for a long time. Then he went back inside to find his wife. The ride home from the Hargrove assembly was the quietest carriage ride of their marriage, and in 3 years that was saying something considerable. Eleanor sat with her bare hands folded in her lap. She had not retrieved her gloves from the silver tray, and watched the dark Virginia countryside move past the window. Nathaniel sat across from her with no document. This time no letter, nothing to read. He simply sat, and occasionally she could feel his eyes on her, and she did not turn to meet them. He had nothing to say. She had already said everything. When the carriage stopped at Ashford House, and the footman opened the door, Eleanor stepped down without assistance and walked straight to the front entrance. She said good night to Mrs. Hart at the top of the stairs, the old housekeeper who always waited up, who had been waiting up since long before Eleanor arrived in this house, and would likely go on doing so long after, and went to her room and closed the door. She did not lock it. Locking it would have implied she expected him to come. He did not come. She had known from the beginning what she was. Not a wife. A solution. 3 years earlier, in the spring of 1817, Eleanor Whitcomb had sat in the parlor of her family's declining Virginia estate and listened to her father explain the arrangement with the careful euphemisms men use when they are asking women to sacrifice themselves for the preservation of something the women did not build and were not consulted about building. "The Ashford alliance is essential," her father said. "The shipping contracts alone would sustain us through the next decade. And Nathaniel Ashford is a decent man, Eleanor. He is not unkind." "He was engaged to Clara," Eleanor said. Her father's pause lasted exactly long enough to confirm that he had hoped she would not say that out loud. "Clara is gone," he said, "and you are here, and the Ashford family has been generous enough to extend the arrangement." Extend the arrangement. As though Eleanor were a piece of furniture being reupholstered for a room that had originally been designed around something else entirely. She had said yes, not because she had wanted to, and not entirely because of the money, though the money mattered. Her family's creditors were not patient men. She had said yes because she was 24 years old, and she had spent her whole life watching Clara be chosen, and had developed over years of practice a functional numbness to being the secondary option. She understood her value in the transaction. She went into it without illusions. What she had not anticipated was how much harder it would be to watch Nathaniel grieve someone else from inside the house where she was supposed to be his wife. I wasn't cruel. She had told people that when they probed Margaret Hargrove, her cousin in Richmond, who wrote letters full of careful questions, the 2 or 3 women at church who watched her with that particular sympathetic attention that was almost worse than open pity. He was not cruel. He was simply absent. Present in the house, present at the table, present in all the physical and legal senses of the word, and entirely absent in every way that made presence meaningful. He said good morning. He asked whether the household accounts were in order. He appeared at her side at social engagements with the punctual reliability of a man meeting a contractual obligation. And then he went to his study, or to the shipping offices in town, or to wherever it was that men like Nathaniel Ashford went when they needed to be somewhere their grief was not observed. In the first months, Eleanor had tried. She had learned to ask about the shipping business, not with false interest, but with genuine effort, because she was not a stupid woman, and she knew that shared interest was a kind of bridge, and bridges could be built where none existed naturally. Nathaniel had answered her questions with the patient precision of a man explaining things to someone he did not expect to understand them, and if he noticed that she understood them entirely, he did not say so. She had tried once very carefully to speak about Clara. "I know this wasn't what you expected," she said. They were at the breakfast table a Tuesday morning in November, and the words came out quieter than she intended. "I know I am not—" She stopped, reorganized. "I would like it if we could speak honestly about the situation." Nathaniel had looked up from his coffee. "The situation," he repeated. "We are married," Eleanor said. "And you loved my sister. And I think pretending that neither of those things is true may be making both of us unhappy in ways we don't have to be." Something moved across his face. Pain, she recognized it, the particular compressed pain of someone who has been very careful about where they put something and does not appreciate being shown that it is visible after all. He set down his coffee cup. "I think," he said carefully, "that some things are better left undisturbed." "For whom?" Eleanor asked. He did not answer that. He picked up his coffee cup again. He returned to his newspaper, and Eleanor understood with a clarity that was almost merciful in its finality that she was not going to be permitted entry into the place where his grief lived, that she would remain for as long as this marriage lasted on the outside of the only thing in him that was truly alive. After that, she stopped trying to get in. She started instead to build something of her own. It began with the ledgers. Ashford House was a substantial property. 200 acres, a working mill. 12 tenant farms spread across the eastern edge of the estate, a small shipping interest that connected to Nathaniel's larger Boston enterprises. The estate manager, a man named Silas Crow, had been in the position for 6 years and carried himself with the particular confidence of a man who has never been seriously questioned. Eleanor had not been given the ledgers. She had found them. She had been looking for a household record that Mrs. Hart said might be in the estate office, and she had opened the wrong cabinet, and she had looked at the numbers in the way a woman who grew up watching her family's money disappear looks at numbers with the eyes of someone who knows what the warning signs feel like before they become emergencies. Something was wrong. The tenant payments did not match the receipts. The repair records showed work that when Eleanor walked the Eastern Farms herself, which she began doing on Tuesday mornings quietly, without announcing the purpose, had clearly not been done. A barn roof that was recorded as replaced still leaked. A drainage channel that was billed for excavation was still flooded. And the tenant families, when she spoke with them, spoke about Silas Crow, with the careful neutrality of people who know that what they say can be used against them. "Mrs. Watts," Eleanor said on one of those Tuesday mornings, sitting in the cramped kitchen of the Watts family farm, with a cup of tea she had not asked for, but accepted with both hands. "How long has the Eastfield drainage been like this?" Martha Watts, a broad-shouldered woman with 6 children, and the permanently provisional expression of someone accustomed to problems that don't get solved, looked at Eleanor for a long moment. "Since before you came to Ashford House, ma'am," she said. "Mr. Crow said it was on the schedule. It's been on the schedule some years now." "And the rent?" Eleanor asked. "Has there been any adjustment given the lost crop yield?" Martha Watts looked at her hands. "Mr. Crow said Mr. Ashford didn't authorize adjustments." Eleanor set her teacup down. "Mrs. Watts, did you ever speak to Mr. Ashford directly about the drainage?" "We sent a letter," Martha said. "Last spring. I don't know if it arrived." Eleanor knew with a quiet, cold certainty that it had arrived. She knew because she had seen the mail intake records, and she knew because Silas Crow handled the mail intake, and she knew because the thing about men like Silas Crow was that they relied on the invisibility of the people above them to maintain the invisibility of what they were doing. She thanked Martha Watts for the tea, walked back to Ashford House, and began keeping her own records. By spring of 1818, she had rebuilt the estate accounts from scratch. She did it in her sitting room at the small writing desk by the window in the hours between breakfast and the social obligations that filled her afternoons. She cross-referenced the ledger entries against the tenant receipts she requested directly against the repair invoices she tracked to the suppliers, against the mill records she obtained by walking to the mill herself and asking the foreman questions that he answered with visible surprise at being asked at all. What she found, laid out clearly across 6 months of careful reconstruction, was that Silas Crow had been systematically diverting tenant payments. Not all of them, not enough to trigger obvious alarm, skimming a portion here and inflating an invoice there, and collecting over 6 years. What amounted to a serious sum, at the expense of families who could not afford to lose it. She told no one. Not yet. She had no authority to act on it, and she understood with the pragmatic clarity that had become her survival mechanism, that a wife who went to her husband with accusations against his trusted estate manager, a wife who had not been asked, who had not been authorized, who had not been given any role in the running of the property, was not a wife who would be taken seriously. She needed more. She needed documentation so complete and so irrefutable that the facts could speak without her having to fight for the right to be heard. So she kept building. What she had not expected was that the tenants would begin to notice. It started small. A nod when she passed the Watts farm on a Tuesday. Martha Watts meeting her at the fence rather than waiting to be sought out. An invitation to come in, have something, stay a moment. And then gradually the word spread. The way things spread in farming communities, sideways, and quietly traveling from one woman's kitchen to another, from one fence line to the next. That Mrs. Ashford came on Tuesdays, that she asked real questions and listened to the answers, that she wrote things down and did not forget them. By summer they were coming to her, not all at once. Carefully, one family at a time, with the hedging and the qualifications of people who have learned that visibility can be dangerous. But they came. The Collins family, whose youngest had been ill through the winter and who had fallen behind on payments that Silas Crow had not reported as outstanding to Nathaniel, but had been collecting interest on privately. The Morrison family, who had been paying for drainage repairs that had never happened. An old man named Harker, who worked the northernmost farm and who handed Eleanor on a warm Tuesday morning in August a crumpled receipt that showed a payment he had made 3 years ago that did not appear anywhere in the official ledgers. Eleanor looked at the receipt for a long time. "Mr. Harker," she said, "may I keep this?" "I kept it because something felt wrong," he said. "I can't read very well, Mrs. Ashford, but I kept it because something felt wrong." She folded it very carefully and put it in her pocket. "You were right to keep it," she said. "Something was wrong." She walked back to Ashford House that morning and went straight to her sitting room and added the Harker receipt to the growing stack of documents in the locked box under her writing desk. And she sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk surface and felt for the first time in longer than she could accurately measure something that was not grief and not resignation. It was purpose, clear and steady and entirely hers. Nathaniel had begun to notice something, though he could not have said precisely what. It was not the Tuesday mornings he left early for the shipping office in town on Tuesdays, and had not connected Eleanor's absences to anything systematic. It was something less specific than that. A change in the texture of the house, some quality in how the servants moved and spoke when Eleanor was present, that was different from how they moved and spoke around him. Mrs. Hart, who had been with the house since before Nathaniel was born, and whose opinion he respected, despite having never told her so, had begun mentioning Eleanor in conversation with a frequency and a warmth that he was slowly becoming aware of. "Mrs. Ashford had me send for the apothecary for the Collins child last month," Mrs. Hart said one evening in the tone of someone providing information they expect will be appreciated. The family couldn't have managed the cost themselves. She arranged it quietly, didn't make a production of it. Nathaniel looked up from his papers. "She did." "She's been seeing to a good many things quietly," Mrs. Hart said. "In case you hadn't noticed." The "in case you hadn't noticed" carried the delicate edge that only a woman who had known a man since he was a boy could deliver without being obviously insubordinate. Nathaniel heard it clearly. He chose not to address it directly. "I'll make a note," he said. "You might do more than that," Mrs. Hart said, and left the room. He sat with that for a while. The truth was that Eleanor had become harder to ignore. Not because she was demanding attention. She had stopped doing anything that resembled demanding attention long before the Hargrove Assembly, but because the space she occupied in the house had somehow expanded without her appearing to try. The tenants spoke well of her. The household staff deferred to her with a respect that was different from the performance of deference that servants offer employers they do not particularly regard. And there was something about the way she moved through the house lately. Something settled. something oriented, as though she had found a direction she was no longer asking his permission to travel. He did not know what to do with that. He had spent 3 years not doing anything with Eleanor, and the habit was deep, and the guilt around it was deeper. And guilt, he had found, was much easier to manage when the person you had wronged was keeping themselves small enough to be almost invisible. She was not doing that anymore. The first time he sought her out deliberately, not because of a social obligation or a household necessity, was on a Wednesday evening in late August, 3 weeks after the Hargrove Assembly. She was in her sitting room. He knocked. That was the first unusual thing. He had not knocked on her sitting room door before, not once in 3 years, because entering the spaces of a woman you have ignored requires acknowledging that she has spaces worth entering. "Come in," she said. He opened the door. She was at her writing desk, the small oil lamp burning papers spread in front of her that she did not move to conceal, which he noted. She looked up at him with the expression she had developed over 3 years, composed, attentive, revealing nothing more than attentiveness. "Nathaniel," she said. Not surprised, not warm, simply acknowledging his presence. "I wanted to ask," he said, and then stopped because he realized he had not thought carefully enough about how to complete the sentence. Mrs. Hart mentioned the Collins child, the apothecary. "He's recovered," Eleanor said. "He had a bad chest. He should be fine through the winter if the family can keep the cottage warm." She paused. "The east wall of their cottage has a gap that needs filling before October. I've asked the carpenter to see to it." Nathaniel stood in the doorway and looked at his wife, and understood in a way that was uncomfortable in its clarity, that she had been running a significant portion of his estate, and he had not known it because he had never looked. "I wasn't aware you were," he began. "No," Eleanor said without sharpness, simply with accuracy. "You weren't." The silence stretched. "I appreciate it," he said finally. "What you've been doing." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. Something passed through her expression, not anger, not satisfaction, something more tired than either of those. "I didn't do it for your appreciation, Nathaniel," she said. "I did it because it needed doing, and I was the one who saw it." She turned back to her papers. "Good night." He stood in the doorway a moment longer. Then he said very quietly, almost to himself, "I owe you more than I've given." Eleanor did not look up, but her pen stopped moving. "Yes," she said, "you do." He pulled the door closed behind him. He stood in the hallway with his hand still on the doorknob, and the sound of her pen resuming on the other side of the wood, and the feeling from the garden at the Hargrove estate, returned with full force, that specific particular fear that has nothing to do with danger and everything to do with loss. The fear of a man who is beginning to understand slowly and too late that the thing he has been walking past every day is irreplaceable, and that the walking past has been going on for a very long time. Down the hall, in her sitting room, Eleanor Whitcomb. Ashford set her pen down, pressed both hands flat on the papers in front of her, and breathed. She did not let herself feel the warmth of what he had said. She knew better than anyone the difference between a man who sees you and a man who has merely for a single moment noticed that you exist. She had 3 years of evidence to weigh against one sentence in a doorway. She picked up her pen and went back to work. Julian Harrow arrived at Ashford House on a Thursday morning in early September with a leather satchel, a letter of introduction from the Hargrove family's legal counsel, and the unhurried manner of a man who had learned that the most useful thing he could bring into a complicated situation was patience. Nathaniel received him in the front study. Eleanor was not invited to that meeting. She learned of Julian's arrival the way she had learned most things about the running of Ashford House in the early years, from Mrs. Hart, who mentioned it in passing while discussing the week's household arrangements with the particular casually placed precision that the old housekeeper used when she wanted Eleanor to have information without appearing to have delivered it deliberately. "Mr. Harrow will be staying in the east guest room for the duration of his work," Mrs. Hart said. "Something about the estate contracts. Mr. Ashford asked for the dining room to be set for 3 this evening." 3. Eleanor noted that. She dressed for dinner that evening with more care than she had taken in months, and she noticed herself doing it, and she was honest enough with herself to acknowledge what that meant, and honest enough with herself not to feel ashamed of it. She was not dressing for Julian Harrow. She was dressing because something in the house had shifted since that Wednesday evening in the hallway, since Nathaniel's hand on the doorknob and his voice saying, "I owe you more than I've given," and she was not ready to trust the shift, but she was also not willing to walk into whatever was coming, looking like a woman who had given up entirely. She had not given up. She had simply redirected. Dinner was the first meal in 3 years that felt like an actual occasion. Julian Harrow sat across from Eleanor with the easy attentiveness of a man who had grown up in rooms where conversation was considered a serious activity, and within 10 minutes had asked her 3 questions. Real questions, the kind with follow-up and genuine interest about the estate's tenant situation, the mill operations, and the eastern drainage problem she had been tracking for a year. Nathaniel watched this from the head of the table with an expression that Eleanor, who had spent 3 years learning to read his silences, could not immediately categorize. "Mrs. Ashford," Julian said, "you mentioned the drainage has been recorded as repaired in the official accounts, but you've been to the site yourself." "5 times, Eleanor said. "The channel hasn't been touched. The Morrison field is still losing approximately a third of its yield to standing water every season." Julian set down his fork. "And the repair was billed to the estate 3 years ago, $42 according to the ledger." She paused. "The Morrison family paid a drainage adjustment fee to Mr. Crow that same season, separately from their regular rent." Julian looked at her steadily. "You have the records." "I have copies," Eleanor said. Across the table, Nathaniel's wine glass stopped halfway to his mouth. "Eleanor," he said slowly, "how long have you had copies of those records?" "Since last winter," she said. She met his eyes directly. "I was waiting until I had enough to be worth bringing to someone who could act on them." The table was very quiet. "And do you," Julian asked, "have enough?" "Yes," Eleanor said. "I believe I do." Julian Harrow looked at Nathaniel Ashford with the expression of a man professionally trained to observe people, and what he saw on Nathaniel's face in that moment was something between pride and devastation. The particular expression of a man realizing that the person sitting 3 feet to his left has been doing significant work in the dark for a very long time, entirely without him. After dinner, Julian asked to see the documents. They sat in Eleanor's sitting room, the 3 of them, which was itself an unusual enough arrangement that Mrs. Hart found several reasons to pass the hallway twice, and Eleanor opened the locked box under her writing desk and laid out 14 months of reconstructed accounts across the surface of the table. Julian went through them methodically, asking questions as he went, and Eleanor answered each one without hesitation, citing her sources, noting the methodology she'd used to cross-reference, flagging the 3 places where she had gaps she hadn't been able to close. Nathaniel sat in the armchair to her left and said almost nothing. But Eleanor was aware of him in the way she was always aware of him in small rooms. His presence a kind of barometric pressure she had learned to read without looking. After an hour, Julian sat back. "Mrs. Ashford," he said, "this is remarkable work. You understand that, I hope." "I understand it's accurate," Eleanor said. "It's more than accurate. It's thorough in a way that will make it very difficult for Crow to challenge." Julian looked at the papers again. "You've essentially built the case from the ground up." "Someone had to," Eleanor said quietly. Nathaniel made a small sound. Not a word. Just a sound, low and involuntary, the kind a person makes when something lands somewhere they didn't expect. Eleanor did not look at him. "I'll need a few days to review everything formally," Julian said, beginning to collect the papers. "And I'd like to speak with some of the tenant families directly, if you can arrange introductions." "Martha Watts will talk to you," Eleanor said immediately. "Old Mr. Harker as well. The others you'll need to earn it. They're not accustomed to people with legal authority taking their side." "Then I'll earn it," Julian said simply. He said it the way a decent man states an obvious fact without performance or reassurance seeking. And Eleanor felt the truth of it land, felt the rarity of someone simply saying a thing and meaning it. She stood and gathered the remaining papers, and Julian helped her reorder them with the matter-of-fact collaboration of 2 people who are both taking the work seriously. And Nathaniel watched from the armchair and felt something he had no comfortable name for building steadily in his chest. The days that followed were the strangest of Nathaniel's marriage. Julian Harrow worked with the focused efficiency of a man who was good at his job and knew it, spending his mornings reviewing documents and his afternoons riding out to the tenant farms. Eleanor accompanied him on these visits. That was the practical reason the tenants trusted her, and her presence unlocked doors and tongues that would have stayed closed to an unknown lawyer. But it meant that Nathaniel watched from the study window on Wednesday and Thursday and Friday, his wife riding out side by side with another man, returning 2 hours later with the particular animated tiredness of someone who has been engaged in real work that matters. He had not seen her look like that in 3 years. He had not, if he was being precise about it, seen her look like that at all. He told himself he was not jealous. He reviewed his shipping accounts. He wrote 3 letters that did not require writing. He stood at the window for longer than the window required standing at. On Friday afternoon, Mrs. Hart brought him tea he hadn't asked for and set it on his desk with the careful neutrality she employed when she was about to say something that he was not going to enjoy. "Mr. Harrow seems to think very highly of Mrs. Ashford's work," she said. "I'm aware," Nathaniel said. "She seems well," Mrs. Hart said. "She seems more like herself these days, if you'll forgive my saying so." Nathaniel looked up. "What does that mean exactly?" Mrs. Hart looked at him with the patient directness she had used on him since he was 9 years old, and lying about whether he'd done something he'd done. "It means that when a person has been made to feel invisible for long enough, and then someone sees them clearly, they remember what they actually look like, and everyone around them notices." She left the tea and left the room. Nathaniel sat with his hands flat on the desk and the untouched tea cooling beside him, and understood with uncomfortable clarity that Mrs. Hart was telling him the truth, and that the truth was this: Eleanor was thriving, and it had nothing to do with him. He went looking for her that evening. Not because he had planned to, because he passed the garden and heard voices. Eleanor's voice and Julian's coming from the bench near the tulip poplar. The same bench where she had sat alone the night of the Hargrove assembly and told him she was finished waiting. He stopped. I was not close enough to hear the words clearly. Only the rhythm of the conversation back and forth easy, punctuated by Julian's low laugh, and then Eleanor's, and her laugh was real. He could tell even from a distance that it was real, the specific, unguarded quality of it that he had heard so rarely in 3 years of marriage that he had almost forgotten it existed. He stood very still. Julian said something, and Eleanor responded, and then she said something that made Julian shake his head slowly, with what looked like genuine admiration, and he said something back, and Eleanor laughed again. Nathaniel turned and went back inside. He sat in his study without lighting the lamp until the room was completely dark, and he sat with the fact of what he had just seen, and he was honest with himself in the way that darkness sometimes makes honesty unavoidable. What he felt watching Eleanor laugh with Julian Harrow was not concern for propriety. It was not calculation about appearances or social consequences. It was grief. Genuine, specific grief, not for Clara, which was the grief he knew how to carry, the grief he had been using as a wall for 3 years, but for Eleanor. For the woman on the other side of his dining room table, who had built 14 months of documented evidence in a locked box under her desk, and never asked him once to notice. For the woman who had married him, knowing she was a replacement, and had not, as far as he could tell, ever allowed herself a single moment of open bitterness about it. He had wasted her. That was the word that came to him in the dark, and it was not a comfortable word, and it was accurate. He had wasted 3 years of a woman worth more than the best version of himself he had managed so far. The confrontation with Silas Crow came on a Saturday. Nathaniel had called Crow to the main house for what Crow believed was a routine estate review. Julian was present. Eleanor had asked to be present, and Nathaniel had said yes, and the yes had come out of him faster than he'd intended, as though something in him had already decided before the question was finished, that she had earned the right to be in any room in this house she chose. Crow walked in with the confidence of a man who had never been seriously challenged. He was broad-shouldered, well-dressed for his position, with the particular social fluency of someone who has spent years managing powerful people's expectations of him. He nodded to Nathaniel. He nodded to Julian. He looked at Eleanor the way men like Crow always looked at women they had categorized as irrelevant, a brief dismissive scan that registered presence without granting significance. Julian laid the reconstructed accounts on the desk. Crow looked at them. His confidence did not collapse immediately. Men like Crow had practiced versions of themselves for situations like this, but it shifted. A subtle tightening around the jaw. A slight recalibration of where his eyes went. "These figures aren't familiar to me," he said. "Where did these come from?" "From the original receipts," Julian said. "Cross-referenced with supplier records, tenant payment confirmations, and repair contractor invoices. The methodology is documented." Crow turned to Nathaniel. "Sir, I'd want to understand who compiled this and under what authority." "I compiled it," Eleanor said. The room turned. Crow looked at her with an expression she had seen before. Not fear, not yet, but the precursor to it, the moment when a man decides whether to dismiss or to fight. He chose to dismiss. It was the choice she had anticipated. "Mrs. Ashford," Crow said with a carefully measured courtesy that was also contempt. "Estate accounts are a technical matter. I'm not sure." "Mr. Harker's receipt," Eleanor said. She slid a paper across the desk. "October 1815. Drainage fee paid directly to you, $40. Not recorded in the estate ledger. Not credited to the Ashford accounts." She slid another paper. "The Morrison family's repair contract billed to the estate in full, payment confirmed by the contractor. Work not performed. Independently verified." Another paper. "The Collins rent adjustment that was reported to Mr. Ashford as approved by the tenants. Mrs. Collins's signed statement that she agreed to no such adjustment and was told the adjustment was Mr. Ashford's requirement." Each paper landed on the desk with the soft finality of something that cannot be taken back. The confidence drained out of Crow's face in stages, and what was left underneath was not the dignity of a man who has been misunderstood. It was the naked calculation of a man who is determining his remaining options. "This is," he began. "Documented," Julian said. "Thoroughly." Crow turned to Nathaniel with the last instrument available to him. The appeal to masculine authority. The assumption that a husband who had not been paying attention for 3 years could still be leveraged against a wife who had. "Sir, this woman has been operating outside her proper sphere, conducting her own investigation, accessing estate records she had no authority to." "She had every authority," Nathaniel said. His voice was quiet, but it cut. Crow stopped. "She is the mistress of this estate," Nathaniel said. "Every record in this house is within her proper sphere. Every conversation with every tenant on this property is within her proper sphere." He looked at Crow with the cold, controlled precision of a man who has been in enough business confrontations to know that the moment you start being loud is the moment you have lost. "The question of authority," he said, "is not about my wife. It's about you." The silence in the room lasted several seconds. Then Crow looked at Eleanor. Really looked at her for the first time, with an expression that had nothing left of the dismissiveness he'd carried in. "I want to speak with a lawyer," he said. "You're looking at one," Julian replied. After Crow was escorted from the property by 2 of the estate workers, the study went very quiet. Julian collected his papers with methodical calm. Eleanor stood at the side of the room with her arms folded, and the particular stillness of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a very long time and has just set it down and isn't sure yet what their body feels like without the weight. Nathaniel was standing by the desk. He was looking at Eleanor. He had been looking at her for most of the confrontation with Crow. She had felt his eyes on her, the way she always felt his attention when he actually directed it. Rare enough to be notable, specific enough to be unmistakable. Julian finished with his papers, snapped his satchel closed, and looked between them both with the perceptiveness of a man who understands when he is the third person in a conversation that only needs 2. "I'll write up the formal findings this afternoon," he said to Nathaniel. "I'd recommend pursuing the recovery through County Court. Harker's receipt alone should be sufficient to open the matter." He looked at Eleanor. "Mrs. Ashford, I want you to know that I intend to cite your documentation in full in the formal report. It deserves to be on record." Eleanor looked at him. "Thank you, Mr. Harrow, for all of it." "The thanks belong to your own work," Julian said simply. "I just read what you wrote." He left the room. His footsteps moved down the hall, and then there was only the two of them. Eleanor and Nathaniel in the quiet study, with the papers still spread across the desk. Nathaniel moved toward her. Not quickly, the way a man moves when he is not sure of his welcome. "Eleanor," he said. She looked at him. "I need you to know," he started and stopped. And the stoppage was not Nathaniel's usual controlled composure. It was something rawer than that. Something that had not been in his voice the night he stood in her doorway and said, "I owe you more than I've given." That had been an acknowledgement. This was something harder to manage. "I need you to know that I am ashamed. Not of what you did. What you did was extraordinary. I am ashamed that you had to do it without me. That you spent 14 months building this case alone because you understood correctly that I wasn't the kind of man you could bring it to." Eleanor was very still. "That's not the husband I want to be," Nathaniel said. "I don't know if it matters. I don't know if I've made it impossible for it to matter. But I need you to know that I see it." The room was very quiet. Eleanor looked at her husband, at the controlled, wounded, genuinely remorseful man standing in front of her, and she felt something that was not forgiveness, and was not resolution, and was not the simple warm relief of being finally seen, because she was not going to let one speech in a study undo 3 years of evidence. She was not that woman anymore. The woman who would have been undone by one speech had left herself behind somewhere around the second winter of this marriage, but she also felt underneath all of that something small and careful and real. The first thread of something that was not quite hope, but was not quite not hope either. She said, "I know you see it, Nathaniel." She let that be enough for now. That evening at dinner, Julian Harrow mentioned casually that he expected the legal proceedings would take him through the end of the month. Nathaniel said that was entirely agreeable. Eleanor said she would have Mrs. Hart make sure the East guest room remained comfortable. Nathaniel looked at her when she said it, and for one brief, unguarded moment, the look on his face was not composure. It was not calculation. It was a man watching the woman across the table and trying very hard not to lose her. Eleanor moved out of Ashford House on a Tuesday. Not dramatically. Not in the middle of the night with a packed trunk and a tearful scene in the front hall. She did it the way she did most things, quietly, practically, with the composed efficiency of a woman who had been making decisions on her own for long enough that the mechanics of it no longer required much deliberation. She told Mrs. Hart first. That was the courtesy she felt she owed not to Nathaniel, not to the social expectations of a county that would have opinions regardless, but to the woman who had watched her navigate 3 years of this marriage with the steady, wordless loyalty of someone who understood exactly what was happening and had never once pretended otherwise. "The Chapel Cottage," Eleanor said. It was a small property at the eastern edge of the Ashford land, a quarter-mile from the estate chapel, used for visiting clergy and occasionally for estate workers during harvest season. "It's empty through October. I've spoken with Reverend Aldrich and he has no objection." Mrs. Hart looked at her for a long moment. Her expression did not change into pity, which Eleanor had been braced for and which she would not have been able to tolerate. It changed into something more like recognition, the look of a woman who had seen this coming and had already decided what her role in it would be. "I'll have linen sent over this afternoon," Mrs. Hart said. "Thank you, Abigail." It was the first time Eleanor had used her given name. Mrs. Hart absorbed this without visible reaction, which was its own kind of grace. "Shall I tell Mr. Ashford?" Mrs. Hart asked. "Or will you?" "I'll tell him," Eleanor said. "I owe him that much." She found Nathaniel in the study where he spent most mornings, since Crow's dismissal, working through the estate accounts himself, now with the focused grimness of a man who has discovered he has been negligent and is attempting to understand the full scope of the damage. He looked up when she entered. He had developed the habit in the 2 weeks since the confrontation with Crow of looking up when she entered rooms. She had noticed it. She had not allowed herself to read too much into it. "I'm moving to the Chapel Cottage," she said. She did not sit. Standing made it cleaner. "Today. I wanted you to hear it from me." Nathaniel put down his pen. The silence lasted 4 full seconds. She counted without meaning to. "Eleanor, I'm not leaving the estate," she said. "I'm not creating a scandal. I'm not asking for anything legal or formal. I am simply going to live in the cottage for a while because I need to breathe, and I cannot breathe properly in this house." She kept her voice level, not cold, simply honest. "I think you understand that." "I don't want you to go," Nathaniel said. It was so direct that it surprised her. In 3 years, he had never said anything that direct about wanting or not wanting her presence. She held it for a moment, this new version of him that had been slowly emerging since the garden bench and the doorway and the study where Crow had been dismantled, and she was careful with it, the way you are careful with something fragile that has not yet proven it can hold weight. "What you want," she said gently, "has been the only thing that mattered in this marriage for 3 years. I need to find out what I want. I need some space to do that without being in the house where I learned to make myself invisible." Nathaniel stood. Not toward her. He had learned in the past 2 weeks that moving toward her required her permission, just stood as though sitting had become insufficient to contain what he was feeling. "Is it Harrow?" he asked. The question came out raw, stripped of the careful management he usually applied to his own vulnerability. Eleanor looked at him steadily. "No," she said. "It is not Mr. Harrow. It is you. It has always been you." "That is the problem, Nathaniel, not the solution." He flinched. She watched him take it. "I'll have my things sent by this afternoon," she said. "Mrs. Hart is arranging linens." She turned to leave. "Eleanor." His voice stopped her at the door. She turned. He was standing behind his desk with both hands flat on the surface, and the expression of a man who is holding himself very still, because the alternative is something he does not trust himself to manage. "How long?" he asked. "How long will you be there?" "I don't know," she said honestly. "That's rather the point." She left. He stayed standing behind his desk for a long time after the sound of her footsteps disappeared down the hall. The county noticed, of course. The county always noticed. By Thursday, the story had traveled in the particular way that stories travel in small Virginia communities, sideways and selectively carrying different weights depending on who was telling it and what they needed it to mean. The version that reached the Pendleton household was that Eleanor Ashford had been discovered in an improper friendship with the visiting lawyer. The version that reached the church women's circle was that Nathaniel had finally driven his quiet wife past endurance with his continued preoccupation with the Vance widow. The version that old Mr. Harker heard out on his north farm was simply that Mrs. Ashford had gone to the chapel cottage, and he nodded when he heard it and said, "Good for her," and meant it. Nathaniel heard the Pendleton version through the barber, which was how men in his position received social intelligence they were not meant to have directly. He came home from town that Thursday with a cold fury that had nowhere obvious to go, stood in his own front hall, and called for Mrs. Hart. "What are people saying?" he asked. Mrs. Hart regarded him with the equanimity of a woman who has outlasted more family crises than this one. "Various things," she said. "About Eleanor and Harrow. Some things," she said. "Are they true?" Mrs. Hart looked at him with the specific patience she reserved for questions she considered beneath him. "Nathaniel Ashford," she said, and the use of his full name was a precision instrument she deployed rarely and always effectively. "That woman spent 3 years in this house loving you past the point where loving you was reasonable, and then spent another 1.5 years protecting your estate without being asked. And she has gone to a cottage a 1/4 mile away because she needs air. And you are standing in your own front hall asking me if she has given you grounds for jealousy." She paused. "I think you know the answer to that question, and I think you're asking it because it is easier than the questions you actually need to ask." Nathaniel stared at her. "What questions are those?" he said very quietly. "Whether you deserve her," Mrs. Hart said, "and if not, what you intend to do about it." She left him in the hall. I went to the cottage that evening. He did not send a note ahead. He walked the 1/4 mile from the house in the summer dusk and knocked on the cottage door and waited. Eleanor opened it. She was in a plain day dress, her hair down, a book in her hand. The cottage behind her was spare and clean, and had the specific quality of a space that a woman has made functional with very little effort because she has always known how to make do. It looked, Nathaniel thought with a sudden painful clarity, more like Eleanor than any room in Ashford House had ever managed to look. "Nathaniel," she said. Not surprised, not unwelcoming. Careful. "May I come in?" She stepped back and held the door. The cottage was small. 2 chairs near the fireplace, a writing desk. She had her papers already. He noticed the work following her like a second nature, a table with a single candle. He stood in the center of it, feeling too large for the space, which was perhaps appropriate. "I heard what people are saying," he said. "So did I," Eleanor said. She sat in one of the chairs and did not offer him the other one immediately, which told him he had not yet earned the ease of being invited to sit. He remained standing. "Mrs. Collins sent word this morning. Apparently I am quite the scandal." "It's wrong," Nathaniel said. "I know it's wrong. I want to correct it." "By saying what?" Eleanor asked. "And to whom?" "By telling the truth." He looked at her directly. "That you left because I gave you no reason to stay. That whatever you and Harrow are to each other, the fault for its possibility lies entirely with me." Eleanor was quiet for a moment. "Julian and I are colleagues," she said. "And I believe genuinely friends. That is the truth of it. If it is more than that to the county's imagination, then the county's imagination is working with the materials we gave it." She looked at him steadily. "You gave it most of those materials, Nathaniel." "I know," he said. He sat down then without being invited, not because he was asserting himself, but because something in his legs had decided they were no longer available for standing. He sat with his elbows on his knees and his hands loosely clasped, and the exhausted honesty of a man who has run out of the energy required to maintain distance. "I have been thinking," he said, "about Clara." Eleanor did not move. "I have been thinking," he continued, "that I owe you the truth about that. The real truth, not the version I have been telling myself." He looked at the floor, then up at her. "I did not love Clara the way I have been grieving her." The silence was very complete. "I loved the idea of her," he said. "I loved what she represented to me at a particular time in my life when I needed something beautiful and uncomplicated to believe in. She was beautiful. She was charming. And she died before she could become a real person to me instead of an ideal, which means I have been mourning a woman I constructed and using that mourning as a reason to avoid the real woman I married." He stopped. "I have been a coward," he said. "That is the honest word for it." Eleanor looked at her husband, this controlled, proud, genuinely broken man, and felt the careful thread of not quite hope that had been growing in her chest since the study 2 weeks ago pull slightly tighter. "Why are you telling me this now?" she asked. "Because you deserve the truth," he said. "And because I am terrified," he said it plainly without dressing it up, "that I have waited too long to tell it." Eleanor was quiet for a long moment. "You might have," she said finally, "not to wound him, because it was true and she owed him truth in return for truth." "I don't know yet, Nathaniel. I genuinely don't know." "I know," he said. "I'm not asking you to know. I'm asking." He stopped, reorganized the way a man does when he is trying to say something he has never had to say before, and the words don't have grooves yet. "I'm asking if I may have the chance to prove something different. Not by telling you, by showing you. Whatever time that requires." Eleanor looked at him for a long time. "You may try," she said. "I won't promise you more than that." "I know," he said again. He stood. He did not press further, which was perhaps the most intelligent thing he had done in 3 years of marriage. "Thank you for letting me in." "Good night, Nathaniel," she said. He walked back to Ashford House in the full dark, and the distance felt both very short and considerable. The next 2 weeks were unlike anything their marriage had contained before. Nathaniel came to the cottage every evening. Not for long, an hour, sometimes less, and he did not come with speeches, or with the pressure of a man trying to accelerate a conclusion. He came the way someone tends a fire they have let go cold carefully, with the understanding that the fire will decide its own timing. He told her what he found in the estate accounts. He asked her questions about the tenant families, their histories, their needs, the texture of their situations that she had accumulated over 14 months of Tuesday mornings. He listened to her answers with the complete attention of a man who has discovered late that the person he married is more interesting than anything else in the room. One evening he mentioned almost in passing that he had written to the Morrison family about the drainage repair. Not a letter from the estate office, but a personal letter in his own hand, acknowledging the failure directly and committing to the repair by the end of September. Eleanor looked up from her book. You wrote to them yourself. You told me they needed to know the fault was mine, not theirs, he said. You said that in the study the evening crow was dismissed. You said the tenants had been made to feel responsible for a situation that was never their fault. She did not remember saying that. She had said it, she was sure it was what she believed, but she had not expected him to carry it this far. They'll appreciate that, she said. I sent the same letter to the Collins family, Nathaniel said. And the Harkers. Eleanor set her book down entirely. She looked at her husband sitting across from her in the small cottage with the candlelight making his face look less managed than it usually did, and she thought, this is what he could be. This is the man underneath the grief and the guilt and the walls. This is what I would have married if I had been allowed to meet him. That was well done, she said quietly. He nodded. He did not take the compliment and expand it into something about himself. He simply received it and was quiet, which was, she thought, the right response. Growth, she was learning, looked like this: not declaration, but behavior. Not apology, but change. Julian Harrow came to say goodbye on a Friday morning. He found Eleanor at the cottage and sat with her for half an hour over coffee, with the ease of two people who have done real work together and earned genuine respect through it. He told her the formal report was complete, and the county court proceedings would begin in October. He told her that Harker's receipt had been entered into the record. He told her she would be cited as the primary investigator. They'll notice that, Eleanor said. A wife conducting a legal investigation. They'll notice that the investigation was right, Julian said, which matters more. He looked at her with the direct warmth that had been consistent throughout. What happens now? He asked. Not prying. Simply asking the way a genuine friend asks. Eleanor looked at her coffee cup. I don't know yet, she said honestly. He's trying. I can see that he's trying. Is that enough? It might be, she said. It isn't yet. Julian nodded slowly. For what it's worth, he said, I think you know what you're doing. I've seen you work. You don't miss much. Eleanor smiled. It was a real smile, the unguarded kind, and it reached her eyes. I miss things, she said. I missed what Crow was doing for 2 months before I caught it. 2 months, Julian said. He'd been doing it for 6 years before you arrived. That landed, and she let it. Julian stood and gathered his hat. Mrs. Ashford, he said at the door. Whatever you decide, you are not anyone's replacement. I hope you know that. You are entirely specifically yourself. That is a considerable thing to be. She stood and offered her hand, and he shook it with the firm respect of one capable person to another. After he left, Eleanor stood in the cottage doorway for a long moment. You are not anyone's replacement. She had known that. She had told herself that in various forms, through 3 years of a marriage, that contradicted it daily. But there was a particular weight to hearing it said plainly by someone with no stake in her hearing it, who simply meant it. She went inside. She sat at her writing desk. She did not write anything for a while. Then she picked up her pen and wrote a letter to Martha Watts, telling her that the Morrison drainage repair had been authorized and the contractor would begin in September. She wrote that the Collins rent adjustment had been reversed. She wrote that old Mr. Harker would be receiving the full restitution of his payment from 1815. She wrote it as Mrs. Eleanor Ashford, mistress of Ashford Estate, not as an interloper, not as a replacement, not as a woman managing a house that belonged to someone else's memory, as herself. Nathaniel came that evening and found her in a different mood than the careful stillness she had been maintaining. She was at the writing desk when he knocked, and she called him in, and he came in and sat in the opposite chair, and she turned from the desk to face him and said without preamble, Tell me about Clara. Not the grief. Tell me who she actually was. He blinked. It was the last thing he had expected her to say. Eleanor, I'm not asking because it hurts me, she said. Or not only because of that. I'm asking because she was my sister, and I watched her from a distance my whole life, and I would like, if we are going to be honest with each other, to start being honest about her too. Not the idea of her. The actual woman. Nathaniel was quiet for a long moment, and then he began to talk. He talked for a long time about Clara's charm and her carelessness about the way she had made every room feel more alive, and the way she had never seemed to notice the people in the room who were quieter than she was about the beautiful recklessness of her, and the ways it had been exciting, and the ways it had been, if he was honest, exhausting. He talked about the guilt of admitting any of that even now. He talked about how much easier it had been to build her into something perfect after she was gone, because perfect things cannot disappoint you, and cannot reveal in retrospect that what you had was not quite what you believed it was. Eleanor listened to all of it. When he finished, she said, "She was like that with me too, dazzling and not quite present. I loved her, and I understood from very young that loving her required not needing much from her." Nathaniel looked at her. "That's yes," he said. "That's exactly it." "You and I," Eleanor said carefully, "have something in common we have never discussed." "We have been given the same education," Nathaniel said slowly, "by the same woman. In different subjects," Eleanor said, "but yes." They sat with that for a while. The candle burned between them. The summer dark settled around the cottage, and something in the room changed, not dramatically, not with the force of a resolution, but with the quiet, irreversible quality of a lock that has finally found its key. "I don't want you to come back because I asked you to," Nathaniel said. "I want you to come back because you want to, because it is your home, and you have decided it is worth returning to." "I know," Eleanor said. "Is it," he asked, "worth returning to?" She looked at him for a long time. "Ask me again in a week," she said. It was not a yes, but it was something far more valuable than a yes offered before it had been earned. It was the truth. The week Eleanor asked for passed the way. Significant weeks tend to pass too slowly in the moments, and too quickly in the accounting of them. Nathaniel came every evening. He did not come with speeches. He did not come with the pressure of a man running a campaign. He came with specific things, a question about the Morrison drainage timeline, that he genuinely needed her input on, a letter from the county court that Julian had forwarded regarding the Crow proceedings that he thought she should see first. Once a basket of early apples from the orchard that Mrs. Hart had packed with the transparent excuse that the cottage had no fruit, and Eleanor should have fruit. He set it on the table without ceremony, and did not make anything of it, and Eleanor did not make anything of it either, and they both understood perfectly what it meant. How was showing up, consistently, without guarantee of return. On the fourth evening he came, and she was not at the cottage. He stood at the door for a moment, and then walked to the Eastern Farms, because that was the most likely place, and he found her at the Watts farm, helping Martha Watts and two of her older children repair a section of fence that had come down in a summer storm. He did not announce himself. He simply picked up the other end of the rail that Martha's eldest was struggling to hold level, and held it steady, while Eleanor drove the nail. And Martha Watts watched this with an expression of profound satisfaction that she did not attempt to conceal. "Mr. Ashford," Martha said, "don't recall seeing you out this way on a Thursday." "First time for most things," Nathaniel said. Eleanor did not look at him while she drove the second nail, but the corner of her mouth moved. They walked back to the cottage together in the early dusk, and it was the first time they had walked somewhere side by side without the performance of a social occasion requiring it, and the difference was considerable. He matched her pace without thinking about it. She did not adjust her stride for him. They were simply two people walking the same direction at the same speed. "That fence has needed repair for 2 weeks," Eleanor said. "I'll send someone tomorrow for the rest of it," Nathaniel said. "Martha's boy is capable," Eleanor said. "Send materials and let him do it. It matters to them to do their own repairs when they can." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "You know them," he said. "You know all of them." "Yes," Eleanor said simply. "I've owned this land for 11 years, he said, "and I do not know my tenants the way you know them after 3. Eleanor glanced at him. "You were busy grieving," she said. It was not sarcasm. It was accurate, and she said it without cruelty. "I was," he said. "That is not an excuse, but it is what happened." She nodded. They walked the rest of the way without speaking, and the silence was different from the silences of their marriage. Not empty, not avoidant, but the kind that exists between people who have already said the necessary things and are now simply being in the same space without it costing anything. At the cottage door she turned to him. "Come in," she said. "I'll make coffee." It was the first time she had invited him in without him knocking first. He understood exactly what it meant, and he did not make a production of it. He simply said, "Thank you," and followed her inside. The week ended on a Sunday. Eleanor went to church as she always did, and Nathaniel appeared at her side before the service, which he had not done since the early months of the marriage, when appearances had still seemed like the primary obligation. He sat beside her in the pew. He did not explain himself. Several members of the congregation noticed, and the noticing traveled around the room in the particular ripple that small communities produce when something significant has shifted without announcement. Mrs. Pendleton leaned toward her companion and said something Eleanor could not hear. Her companion nodded. Eleanor kept her eyes forward. After the service, Reverend Aldrich shook Nathaniel's hand and said with the gentle directness of a man whose job requires him to speak plainly about important things, "Good to see you both together." "It's good to be together," Nathaniel said. Eleanor looked at him. He was not performing for the Reverend. He meant it. She took his arm as they walked out. It was a small gesture and a large one simultaneously, and Nathaniel's entire body registered it. She felt the slight adjustment, the careful stillness of someone receiving something they had not been sure they would receive. And then he covered her hand with his, and they walked to the carriage, and the county saw them and drew its own conclusions, most of which, for once, were correct. The trouble came the following Tuesday. Eleanor was at her writing desk in the cottage when Mrs. Hart arrived on foot, which meant it was urgent because Mrs. Hart did not walk a quarter-mile in the late summer heat for anything that could wait. Eleanor opened the door before she knocked. "What's happened?" Mrs. Hart came inside and sat, which she also did not do, without being invited, unless something was genuinely wrong. "Silas Crowe," she said. "He came to the main house this morning." Eleanor went still. "He's been dismissed. The proceedings have started." "He didn't come for Mr. Ashford," Mrs. Hart said. "He came because he's been talking. To the Pendletons, to the Hargrove staff, to anyone who would listen. He's saying—" She paused with the precision of a woman choosing her words carefully. "He's saying that the accounts you compiled were falsified, that you altered records to cover debts your own family owed the estate, that the investigation was conducted to protect yourself, not the tenants." The silence in the cottage was absolute. Eleanor absorbed this. She felt the shape of it, the specific targeted cruelty of an accusation designed to use her family's genuine financial history against her, to make the truth of her origins into the appearance of a motive. It was clever. She hated that it was clever. "Who has heard this?" she asked. "Enough people," Mrs. Hart said quietly. Eleanor stood. "Where is Nathaniel?" "He rode into town an hour ago. I don't know if he's heard yet." "He will have heard," Eleanor said. She was already at the door. "I need to find him." She found him at the shipping office, not in town, but coming back from it, riding toward the estate with the particular controlled speed of a man who is furious and managing it. She stepped into the road, which was not a safe thing to do, but she was past calculating safety, and his horse pulled up short, and he looked down at her with an expression that she needed to read immediately and read correctly. It was not doubt, it was rage. Clean, directed entirely on her behalf. "You've heard," she said. "Half an hour ago." He dismounted in one motion. "Patterson at the bank told me. Apparently Crowe spent yesterday afternoon at the Pendleton house." His jaw was set in the way it got when he was applying his full capacity for control to something that wanted to break through it. "Eleanor, I want you to tell me you are not worried that I believe a single word of it." She looked at him steadily. "Are you asking me to reassure you, or are you telling me?" "I'm telling you," he said. "I have your records. I have 14 months of your work. I watched you dismantle that man piece by piece with documentation so clean that Julian Harrow cited it in a county court filing. I know what you built, and I know how you built it, and I know who you are." His voice dropped slightly on the last words, not softer, but more exact, the way a man speaks when he has moved past rhetoric into something he actually means. "I know who you are, Eleanor," she breathed. "What do you want to do?" she asked. "I want to go to the Pendleton house this afternoon," he said. And I want to make it very clear in front of whoever is present that my wife compiled those records at my request with my full knowledge and authorization as the properly appointed manager of Ashford Estates tenant affairs." He paused. "And then I want to go wherever else Crow has been and say the same thing." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. "He'll say you're protecting me." "Let him say it," Nathaniel said. "I am protecting you. I'm also telling the truth. Both things are possible at the same time." It was such a simple and complete answer that it took her a moment to find the edge of it. "You should know," she said, "that my father's debts to your estate were settled at the time of the marriage. There is documentation. It was part of the original contract." "I know," Nathaniel said. "I've read the original contract. There is nothing in it that gives Crow's claim any surface to stand on." He looked at her directly. "Shall we go?" She had not expected "shall we." She had expected "I will," the statement of a man acting on his own authority to solve her problem. "Shall we" was different. "Shall we" was a question. "Shall we" was two people moving together. "Yes," she said. "Let's go." The Pendleton House was the kind of establishment that ran on social information, the way a mill runs on water, constantly, powerfully, with considerable noise. Mrs. Pendleton received them in her front parlor with the faintly startled expression of a woman who had not expected the subject of her afternoon's conversation to arrive in person. There were 4 other women present. Eleanor recognized all of them. They recognized her. Nathaniel spoke first, and he did not speak the way he spoke in business negotiations, efficiently to the relevant party with the minimum necessary investment. He spoke to the room. He stood in Margaret Pendleton's parlor, and he said clearly, and without qualification, that the investigation into Silas Crow's conduct had been initiated by Eleanor's findings, conducted with his full knowledge, and authorized by him retroactively. The moment he understood its scope. Retroactively, he said, because his wife had been thorough enough and accurate enough that his authorization had been a formality in all but timing. "The records are currently entered into county court proceedings," he said. "They have been reviewed by a qualified attorney. Any claim that they were falsified is a claim that can be addressed in court, and I intend to make certain it is." He looked around the room without aggression, simply with the cold clarity of a man who has made a decision and is not revisiting it. "My wife saved this estate. She did it without being asked, without being credited, and without making anyone uncomfortable by demanding either. What she did not deserve was to have that work used against her by the man whose theft she exposed." The room was very quiet. Mrs. Pendleton looked at Eleanor. Eleanor met her eyes without apology or softness. She was not performing composure. She simply had it because she had been building it for 4 years, and it was structural now, part of her, in a way that Silas Crow's accusations could not reach. "The documentation is a matter of public record," Eleanor said. "Anyone who wishes to review it may do so through the county clerk's office. The Whitcomb family debts to this estate were settled in 1817 prior to the marriage. That is also documented and also available." She paused. "I am happy to answer any questions. I have nothing to conceal." The silence held another moment. Then, one of the women, Mrs. Aldrich, the Reverend's wife, a woman of few words and considerable moral weight in the community, said simply, "I believed you before you walked in, Eleanor. I believe you more now." The air went out of the room. Not dramatically, but definitively. Mrs. Pendleton said she would send word to the county court that the Pendleton family had full confidence in Mrs. Ashford's account. They left an hour later, and Eleanor did not cry in the carriage, but it was close. Not because of the victory she had expected to win, because she had the truth, and she had learned that the truth properly documented was a durable weapon. She almost cried because of the way Nathaniel had stood in that parlor. Not in front of her, beside her. The difference was the whole world. Crow's final maneuver came 3 days later, and it came publicly, which was either bravado or desperation. Eleanor had decided it was both. He appeared at the Saturday market in town, where half the county made its weekly business, and he said loudly in front of the grain merchant's stall that Nathaniel Ashford had been blinded by a scheming wife, and that the whole investigation was a conspiracy to discredit a loyal employee in favor of a woman who had manipulated her way into a position she had no right to hold. He said it loud enough that a dozen people heard it. One of those people was Nathaniel. He had been at the merchant's stall for a different purpose entirely. He turned slowly when he heard his name, and then he listened, and he let Crow finish, which was a tactical decision. Letting a man exhaust himself in public before you respond is a technique, and Nathaniel Ashford had not built a successful shipping business without knowing how to let an opponent overextend. When Crow finished, Nathaniel looked at him. He did not raise his voice. He did not perform. He spoke at normal volume, which meant that the people who heard him were people who were paying close attention, which meant they would remember it exactly. "Mr. Crow," he said, "you stole from families who could not afford to lose what you took from them. You stole from my estate, and you stole from my wife's documented evidence of that theft. You have now attempted to steal her reputation." He paused. "You have nothing left to take from anyone, because you have nothing left that anyone will accept from you. The court will handle the rest." He turned and walked away. Old Mr. Harker was standing at the edge of the gathering. He watched Nathaniel go. Then he looked at the people around him and said in the plain-spoken way of a man who has lived long enough to say exactly what he means, "That's a husband standing up for his wife. About time." Several people nodded. Several did not. But the ones who nodded were the ones who mattered: the tenants, the tradespeople, the working families of the county who had watched Eleanor Ashford walk their fence lines and sit in their kitchens and write their names in her ledger with care. Those people had their own account of who Eleanor was, and it had been building for longer than Silas Crow had been talking. Eleanor heard what happened at the market from Martha Watts, who had been there for flour and had watched the whole thing from 12 feet away. Martha came to the cottage that afternoon and told her word for word, with the precise satisfaction of someone delivering exactly the news they knew would be received well. Eleanor listened to all of it. "And then he just walked away," she said. "Like it was done," Martha said. "Like it was already finished." She looked at Eleanor with the direct warmth of a woman who has watched someone earn something and is glad to see them get it. "He meant every word, Mrs. Ashford. Anyone watching could see he meant it." After Martha left, Eleanor sat for a long while. She thought about the woman who had dressed for the Hargrove Assembly, knowing she would stand alone by the window. She thought about the woman who had laid her gloves on the silver tray and walked out into the summer heat because there was nothing left to stay for. She thought about the 14 months of Tuesday mornings and locked boxes and careful documentation and the cottage and the week, and Nathaniel holding a fence rail on a Thursday evening without being asked. She picked up her pen. She wrote a single sentence on a piece of paper. She folded it. Then she put on her coat and walked back to Ashford House. Mrs. Hart opened the door before Eleanor reached it. The old housekeeper looked at her with an expression that required no interpretation. She stepped back and held the door wide. Nathaniel was in the study. He was at the desk, but he was not working. He was sitting with the stillness of a man waiting for something without knowing if it was coming. He looked up when she came in. She held out the folded paper. He took it. He unfolded it. He read the single sentence she had written. He looked up at her. "Yes," he said. His voice was not steady. She was glad it was not steady. "I want it understood," Eleanor said, and her own voice was clear and even, not because she was not feeling everything, but because she had learned over 4 hard years how to feel everything and still speak clearly, "that I am not returning to the marriage we had. I am returning to build something different, something honest." "I know," Nathaniel said. He stood. "That is the only thing I'm asking for." "You are not asking," Eleanor said. "I'm telling you the terms." Something moved across his face. Surprise, and then underneath it, the specific recognition of a man who is seeing his wife clearly, perhaps for the first time, and finding that what he sees is not the quiet woman he thought he had married, but someone considerably more than that. "Then I accept your terms," he said. Eleanor nodded. She crossed the room and she held out her hand, not for the courtesy gesture of a woman allowing herself to be led, but palm up flat, the way a person offers a hand to an equal. He took it in both of his. They held a small recommitment the following Sunday. Not a ceremony with guests and announcements that was not Eleanor's nature, and Nathaniel had learned to stop imposing his instincts about appearances over her instincts about what mattered. Just the two of them, and Reverend Aldrich and Mrs. Hart, in the small estate chapel on a bright Virginia morning in late September, when the summer heat had finally begun to relent. Nathaniel spoke without notes. "When I married you," he said, "I told myself I was doing my duty. I told myself that was enough, that duty was a respectable and sufficient foundation for a life. I was wrong." He held her hand, the way he had held it in the study in both of his, like something he intended not to drop. "I married you out of obligation. I am standing here today because I choose to. Because you are the most capable, the most honest, and the most genuinely good person I have known in my life, and I was too blinded by grief and guilt to see it, and I am asking you not as a duty, not as a contract, but as a man who has finally learned to see clearly, to let me spend the rest of this life choosing you every day." Eleanor looked at him. She thought about the word replacement. She thought about how long she had worn it quietly as a fact about herself, the second daughter, the stand-in, the one who arrived after the one who was wanted. She thought about how long she had tried to make herself small enough to fit the space left by someone else's absence, and then she thought about Mr. Harker's crumpled receipt in her pocket. About Martha Watts meeting her at the fence. About 14 months of documentation no one had asked her to compile. About a cottage that had felt more like herself than any grand house. About a man who had come every evening for a week and held a fence rail on a Thursday. She was not Clara's replacement. She had never been anyone's replacement. She was Eleanor Ashford, the woman who had walked out of a summer assembly with her gloves on a silver tray and her dignity entirely intact, who had rebuilt a broken estate from the inside out, without asking anyone's permission, who had stood in a parlor in front of witnesses and told the truth, with nothing but the truth to protect her. She was entirely specifically herself. And that was, as Julian Harrow had said, a considerable thing to be. "I choose you too," she said. "Today, and tomorrow. And with no guarantee beyond that, because honest love doesn't come with guarantees, it comes with choices, and I intend to keep making mine." Reverend Aldrich said something appropriate and good, and Mrs. Hart produced a handkerchief that she clearly intended to use and did. And the Virginia morning came through the chapel windows with the particular quality of early fall light that makes everything look like it has finally settled into what it was always meant to be. Eleanor Ashford walked out of that chapel in the same county, on the same land, in the same marriage, by legal record. And yet nothing was the same, because she was no longer standing in the shadow of a woman who no longer existed, waiting for a man who had not yet learned to look. She was standing in her own light, and the man beside her had finally learned to see. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything.